welcome to Dulcie's, and thank you all for coming on this really disgustingly rainy day, which I actually really love. I wish I was out there and not in here. If no one can hear, can everyone hear this? Yes? Up the back? Yes. Is anyone too warm?
A little bit.
Yeah, same. Is showing an interest in local history and local things. One of the hardest things that we realized going through coronavirus was the fear that community doesn't exist anymore, which is a very real thing when you live in 2020, I think. What we did realize, however, is that the community in this area and Sydney on a broader scale is actually a really tightly knit and well-engaged community. And so when we do things like this, it's actually really rewarding that every time we do a talk like this, it sells out because people are genuinely interested and fascinated in the local history. And thank you so much, Ben. I don't know if that's going to reach me, but let's hope. I really appreciate you all coming. I own Dulcie's. Who hasn't been to Dulcie's before? Holy shit, look at you all. Virgins. Yeah, we're going to do the Rocky Horror thing, man. No. Basically what this is an old strip club. It was probably the worst in the area. It was less a strip club and more a live sex on premises show. Where I'm sitting right now, many have sat before. Probably not in such decadent chairs, but it has been through times. I always thought that it opened probably not long before the King's Court development. So when they knocked the original King's Cross down to build the Cross City Tunnel or the King's Cross Express or whatever that was, what they did is knocked out all the originals. So the Pink Pussycat, the Livio Stripperama, which you can differentiate by the spelling of Stripperama. Livio spelt it with one P. When it moved down to Darlinghurst Road, it was two Ps. Just as a small anecdote that I've learned over the last 2 years. And when it came here, it overtook a place called Studio 44, which was this cute little kind of daggy disco that then turned into Stripperama, and then over the years deteriorated into the cesspit that it was. When we did the renovations, for those of you that I haven't prattled this story on to, it was essentially the first building that got shut down with lockouts because it had no license, no DA. When we took the TVs out of the corners of the room, there was like early 1980s porn like seized into it that had constantly been playing on repeat. We had to excavate the roof at some point, and there was needles that our builder, don't ask how, could date over like when they were made, and he was like, "This is 30 years of fucking needles, mate. This is history." I was like, okay. The landlord was always like, not the landlord, the real estate agent, when he first came down, he was like, "Oh, this is it. It's really cool space. Don't touch the walls. You'll get pregnant." And then the landlord, one of the most amazing things that I found about opening a bar in King's Cross is the memories of King's Cross that people have. And a lot of my generation are like, "Yeah, I used to love King's Cross. We'd go out and get absolutely wasted and hammered." And you'd be like, "Yeah, I kind of miss that too." And then you tell my landlord that, and he's like, "I actually don't miss having to deal with 3 dead girls dumped in the back laneway a month." So there's a really dark underbelly that we don't really realize. And I think going back to what King's Cross is, I'm really conscious that I'm sweating. So please just like, big chill. One of the best things I like about the moment that we're in now is that we're going back to what King's Cross probably was in the time of Abe Saffron, and if not before, which was a much more sophisticated idea of nightlife and entertainment, where things like this can happen while you're drinking and doing all the fun things that you should be doing rather than just getting absolutely wasted and blacking out in a gutter. Or, as my friend Andy did, throwing a milkshake at a taxi because he didn't pick him up. Times have changed, and I want to thank you again. This is a very long circle that I've gone back to, but there was a lot of time that I had to stall with. Thank you so much for engaging with what we're doing and really like picking up the chalice that we're putting down and going along with that. So give yourself a pat on the back for that. You can do that now. Pat yourself on the back. Good work. These talks are really fascinating because what we do is we go into often it's just me being really obsessed with someone. And I say to Duncan, I really love Juanita Nelson. And he's like, I have a story. And I'm like, great, I'm going to put you on stage. And then someone in the Juanita Nelson show goes, oh, Roger Rogerson. And I was like, who is that? Tell me about him. You missed it. We didn't live stream that one either for probably good reason. And then I've always been obsessed with Dawn O'Donnell, who we named a cocktail Burnham Down Dawn after. She is kind of amazing, and we'll go through a lot more of her history very quickly. But what these people are kind of the same reason that we have built our cocktail list around the idea of people, names and places who have changed Sydney's culture, for the better or for the worse. And often, like, we've just released a new menu as well, which is on the pink card, and they're all named after people or places that have a kind of interest to us. This is, give me 1 second. It was really disgusting to feel that, so. So essentially what we're doing with the menus is continuing that tradition and allowing people to engage more with these local identities. Duncan is probably the best person that I know that has all the inside dirt on these things, because it is Sydney and there's always a New South Wales police force story behind it. And Duncan has had years and years of connection, if not within the detectives department, but has close connection with New South Wales Police Force and a whole heap of other people that work within that sphere. So I'm going to invite Duncan up, and while he comes down and joins me on stage, I'm going to run through just quickly what tonight is. We are live streaming it for those who missed out, because these shows sell out within 3 hours often. We do have an audience, hopefully, on YouTube that are following every move. They also have pictures, which you guys missed out on, but you guys got drinks, so plays off well. The other thing is, it's broken into 3 sections. So the first section is very much based on Dawn O'Donnell and the Sydney around this time that we're talking about, so from the late 60s to the early 90s. We'll go for an intermission. The second section will be about the murder on Oxford Street. And then the last section will be a question and answer session. So in that question and answer session, you'll get a chance to write down everything that you've wanted to ask throughout the day. Make sure the questions are good, because I really like that section. Between every section, there'll be an intermission. We can't stay open if people don't buy drinks. So buy drinks. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Duncan on stage. Give him a round of applause, and we'll start the chat.
Thank you. Lovely.
Yeah, the Harris Farm, actually.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it's surprisingly cheap too. I really like them.
better.
Harris Farm for flowers, everyone. They don't sponsor us, so I bought them. So Duncan, let's talk about late 60s, Dawn O'Donnell, who she was, what Sydney was like. I think it's already on.
Oh, good. That's even easier.
Yeah.
That's even easier. There we go. I suppose, the Dawn O'Donnell story, and Dawn, for a couple, almost 2 generations, was a face that was unmistakably part of Sydney's gay scene. She and her business partner, Roger Claude Teyssedre, were the commercial heart of this gay Sydney. They developed the venues that many of us went to, venues that many of us wouldn't admit to going to, and venues a lot of us stumbled out of on the rare occasion you could actually get drunk in one of Dawn's venues, because the running joke around Oxford Street for years was you can't get drunk in one of Dawn's places because everything is so watered down. Dawn's some of you may have seen the unusual documentary made on her called Croc A Dyke Dundee, which features a very small, somewhat nuggety human being laughing a lot. Dawn, I'll go back, let's start at the beginning, probably make it a bit easier. Dawn was, I think from memory, born in Paddington, grew up with her grandmother. Her mother was a little bit wayward. Dawn was apparently a very talented figure skater, and on ice, and she went across to Europe and she practiced as an ice skater. She got a certain degree of fame, I suppose. Curiously enough, some years ago I interviewed a lovely old lady who was in fact an international skating champion, who said, oh, Dawn was a good mate of mine. She borrowed most of my life for her own biography, but she did have some talents. Dawn was always one of these people who she was alert, she was pragmatic, she was fast on her feet, which helped her very much in business. She came back to Australia and she was married to a chap called Irwin, who was a butcher. I've seen it described as both Double Bay and Rose Bay, but I'm pretty confident it was Rose Bay. And it was in the Rose Bay butcher shop, unhappily married to her husband, that Roger Claude, an emigre from Paris, arrived one day. Now, Roger was this very grand creature. I only met him a couple of times, and some would say he was delightful, others would say he was up himself. I'm of the latter. Roger swept in and allegedly said to Dawn, "Those are great legs, you must be a lesbian." Now, at this point, I would have to say that if legs were the dead giveaway, Roger Claude must have missed the rest of it, because she was short, nuggety, with a fairly rich tenor voice, and she looked like the lesbian from Central Casting. Now, as a girl, I don't think she ever looked any different, to be honest. Dawn wasn't playing with dolls. Well, some dolls.
I think the term Croc A Dyke Dundee really paints the picture of the stoic woman she was physically.
Yes, she was squat, to put it politely. She built like a beer keg, reasonably rough round the edges, but also very, very bright and very, very engaging. She was a natural salesperson. When she left the marriage and decided that she was playing for a different team, leaving her husband to his sausages and chops in Rose Bay, one of her first business adventures was into a car park. Dawn, like Abe Saffron, who was very much the dominant figure at the time, Dawn could make as much money out of a square foot of building space. And this is where that was her talent. Take a square foot and screw every buck out of it. And Abe was exactly the same. The classic landlord, really good at what they do. From car parks, she moved into establishments that may or may not have been brothels. Now, Dawn didn't run the brothels, but she, like Abe, owned the building. And her first string of brothels, which are still there, if you take a wander down to the bottom of, over the hill into Liverpool Street, cross over and head towards where I think it's now the East Village pub is. On the other side of the road, there's a stylish recent development, and then a couple of houses where the doors open and there's a vague red glow inside. Those houses have been knocking shops since my father was around, and possibly even before that.
Are they still knock shops?
Yeah, suffice it to say, there's an establishment there that the door is open and there's a lovely glow from the kitchen, which is reddish hue. I walked past the other night and thought, that's a tradition still keeping going.
I went to a party there at one. Don't run.
Could be.
Yeah.
Dawn bought these properties. This is an example of what a superb opportunity she was. The buildings were originally owned by a bloke called Joe Borg, who was pretty much the vice king of Sydney in the 60s. Joe had offended somebody one morning, and he hopped into his Holden ute, put the key in the ignition, turned the key on, which then set off a rather large pack of gelignite under the seat, and Joe was last seen sort of trying to escaping Bondi at a reasonable trajectory. So that was the end of Joe. So Dawn had no involvement in this, I hasten to add. Dawn seized an opportunity, the properties were there, and she bought them, and she found herself as a landlord with sitting tenants and sometimes lying tenants. And it made lots. And back in Sydney in those days, prostitution was incredibly profitable. East Sydney, off Stanley Street, Chapel Street, Liverpool Street. An artist whose name completely eludes me once described the sound of the crowds descending at dusk as howling. Streets were howling with men trying to do business.
Is that the Slessor poem? Kenneth Slessor?
No, it was about the same period actually. But yes, I can't remember his name; it's completely gone. But so the streets were just vibrating with blokes on the hunt and girls hoping to give them a hand and other things. I'll leave that. So this business is going well. She also is at that stage. She knows Roger Claude, and they go into businesses themselves. They start developing jointly and severally what became the 70s and 80s gay hub of Sydney around Oxford Street. Steam baths, pubs, nightclubs, sex on premises venues. Places like the Tool Shed, which I think is still kicking around somewhere.
Yeah.
Signal in Oxford Street, which recently closed, which actually started down in Crown Street beside where the City Gym is. They ran these businesses and they ran them very efficiently. Alcohol was watered down. Roger was famous for serving beef that was probably horse meat. The running joke, Leo Schofield says that you walk into one of Roger Claude's places and order a Brumby burger. And Roger was caught periodically for this, but I think the only reason he was caught is he probably offered an insufficient bribe to the health inspectors. So these guys were fantastic business around Sydney, and all of a sudden gay people had somewhere to go.
And this is where I stopped you last time, because I actually want to give everyone like a frame of reference as to where Sydney was. I never really understood this until someone explained it to me in quite good detail. Sydney being a really good working harbour, the neighbouring suburbs around the harbour were often kind of working areas. So Woolloomooloo, obviously, I don't know if this is news to everyone or like you knew it, but I didn't. And what happened is that when Botany Bay kind of took over the main port of operations because of the invent of shipping containers, you didn't need the people to clear ships and move it as much as what you could with just a forklift and a shipping container. So these whole areas and swathes of suburbs suddenly became essentially redundant, and you had areas like Oxford Street and Woolloomooloo that kind of sat a bit dormant, and there were abandoned pubs and huge buildings that once used to serve these entire shipping industries that now just kind of were empty, and in suburbs that were less than desirable. Like Paddington, I think up until the 60s was the worst white slum in the British Empire, including Mumbai.
You're pretty much on the money. It was a dump.
Yeah. So it's like, I actually think it's a really important point to realise that Paddington and these areas have never always been as affluent as what we expect them to be. And so when there is an opportunity for these like streets to have a bit of revitalisation, Dawn, with such a keen eye and kind of shrewd understanding of business, is the perfect person to kind of sweep in.
And I suppose what the other compelling point for the gay community too is that real estate was there, and there also, we were chatting about it a while ago, the housing was so bloody cheap. You could actually move in there, get a property, either rent it or buy it for peanuts, because no one really wanted to live around here. I remember my parents, when I moved across to the city, looking me askance and saying, "Why would you want to live there?" I didn't bother telling them the reason, I just enjoyed it. It was a great place to go, and the community built up around that. The businesses came in around the people came because the business was there, and the entire place started to boom. We had this wonderful village, a relatively safe place, a place where you could actually go out, get seriously trashed, and make it home in one piece most nights.
And interestingly, you said this last week, that it was often the ostracised members of the community, the artists, the gays, the single women who were finding these areas and able to live in these areas because of the accessibility.
Yeah.
Right?
They were accessible. It was close to the city, it was close to the harbour, it was close to the airport. And it just had this wonderful sense of community, and everyone left each other alone. A community was there if you needed them, but you could also be who you wanted to be, and no one cared. It was miles away from the quarter acre that we all grew up on, with the hillsides in the backyard and neighbours looking at you and thinking, you're a bit different. This is a place where difference, like King's Cross, difference was accepted, celebrated. No one cared, and if you did care, you were in the wrong spot. Go back to Mossman, or other suburbs, I hasten to add. And in this they thrived. All these really unusual people gathered together, and we became the common herd around here, which is great. Into that, and sort of sitting on top of this, and I'll get back to the point. Sitting on top of this round here was Abe Saffron, who was pretty much king of the entertainment industry and had been since the end of World War II. And Abe had had his ups and downs over the years. He'd been called a charlatan and all sorts of things. And the great oddity, when Abe was dragged before a Royal Commission into people who sold booze after hours, Abe's giving evidence, not telling the truth, because he wasn't particularly good at that all the time, and sitting at the bar table giving him absolute hell were this phalanx of lawyers, many of whom were his clients, who'd sort of hang up their wig and gown at the end of the day and then go to one of Abe's places and drink after hours. It's just how we work. There was lots of facade, not much behind it. Cherubs and all that sort of stuff. It was in appalling taste. Upstairs, just round the back, was a typical Dawn and Roger business as well. They found they had a sort of a space, a void in the roof, which they turned into the original Signal Club, or as a mate of mine said, was particularly efficient. You could go in there, get a beer and a polish and be out by 6:30. And in the grand tradition of Dawn and Roger, there wasn't a big bill on lighting. It was all sort of gloomy. Half a chance you'd actually fall over your legs unless you were really careful. Downstairs was Jules. Jules was actually quite a respectable establishment when they first put it up. It had sort of second-tier US acts coming through, people you'd probably heard of, but maybe wouldn't race to see. And lots of drag shows and all that sort of stuff there. In 1977, it was looking a bit shabby. And then one night, up in smoke, gutted by fire, but not gutted to the point it was irredeemable, it was renovatable. And lo and behold, after a reasonable amount of time, it was beautifully renovated, the insurance companies paid for everything, and Jules was back up and running again. But the one that we all love, and is Capriccio's and Oxford.
Of Dawn being a bit of a shady underground character, but she did pioneer some pretty amazing venues, Patches. A lot of people remember, which was down on Pitt in Tytown?
No, Patches was directly opposite the Exchange Hotel. I think it's above. It's now that sort of.
Did you say DCM?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah. DCM.
Well, it goes back. It started. Well, sorry, it started life, I think, as an old theatre. Then it became Club 33 from memory, which was a gambling joint that wasn't there, where the Premier would never be seen, nor Kerry Packer, nor most of Sydney. Then it opened. Dawn opened it as Patches, and Dawn and Roger Claude.
With the Australia's first light up disco floor, that's the one.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which I don't think the council knew about either. A mate of mine was the electrician there. He spent a lot of time taping things together. It's surprised it didn't go up, actually. That was.
She probably wanted it too.
Yeah. She was making too much money out of it. Right. I mean, if the lights ever came on in Patches, you'd run. The place was disgusting.
Now, and I do want to go back, because while we're saying a lot of kind of fun, naughty things about Dawn, 1978, when we did our first ever Mardi Gras talk here, we got Miss 3D, who told us about the actual first parade and, well, the first protest. Interestingly enough, I've always loved the fact that Dawn was kind of an incidental gay rights activist, in the sense that she paid for everyone's bail who got locked up after that first 78 march, which I always found really amazing. And Duncan's laughing because the way that I kind of was told this story was this beautiful romanticised story about Dawn doing that, which kind of made my soul bleed a little bit for like this lost lesbian saint of gays. Only to realise that when someone said, "Oh, Dawn, what made you do that? Like, what goodness in your soul did you reach to grab that?" And she goes, "Darling, you can't make money off gays if they're in prison." So I think that there's good, and there's probably just a bit of naughtiness herself that she brought to the conversation. I also really like this point, because we get to actually talk about the power that she had in creating these safe spaces for gay and queer people. Was it Ruby's, the lesbian bar?
Yeah, Ruby Reds.
Ruby
which,
Reds.
From my recollection, was opened occasionally around town, but its last last time it was around, it was above the bottle shop in Crown Street that Abe owned. So there were Crown Street cellars downstairs and Ruby Red's upstairs. I actually went to the reopening, I've just remembered that. With a socialite.
What happens there?
With a socialite from Double Bay, it was bizarre. Well, she was, a socialite from Double Bay, myself in a lesbian bar thinking, what do we do now? Try to have a drink and realising even the wine was watered down. It's nice.
But it is like, and Duncan and I have spoken a lot about this, and I think like my generation of young queer adults don't really understand the power and the desperate need for these safe spaces that they were created. And I think for Dawn and Roger to kind of create those spaces is actually quite important, and they deserve the kind of the respect and the reverence that they were the pioneers of creating safe LGBT spaces, because they went on to create the After Patches, they did the Aubrey, which...
That was the lovely Nanette.
Oh, so Dawn didn't do that?
No, Dawn, I think Dawn would have loved the Aubrey, but Nanette got there first, and about, gee whiz, 80, 81.
And so, but Dawn did the Imperial for sure.
Dawn did the Imperials and the Newtown Hotel.
Yeah.
I think when we were chatting about this last time, when she first got hold of the Imperial Hotel, mate and I went out to have a look. It's quite an excursion to Erskineville from Darlinghurst.
Wouldn't know.
Quite terrifying. Anyway,
Would not know.
we went out. We hadn't been out there before, and he said, I hear she's opened a new bar underneath, and I thought, oh God, it'll be the old cellar. It'll be pitch as black as pitch.
But where did Duncan go?
We wandered through upstairs and thinking, oh, this is Dawn, the carpet could do with it, and needs a repaint, the carpet's probably second hand, blah, blah, blah. Then we went round the back into the laneway, and lo and behold, there was a glimmer of light in the door to the cellar. And you wander downstairs, there's this poor bastard trying to work behind the bar under this pretty much a torch. And the rest of the space is dark, pitch black. And oddly enough, had a few people in it. I don't know what they were doing, but they seemed to be very happy. And that was the Dawn formula. Something you can hose out without much in the way of lighting. Fabulous.
Duncan always brings up these amazing venues that he goes to, and he vaguely understands what's going on.
I was inquisitive.
Everyone that's come to these talks before, like, Duncan's been to places and seen some things. All right, so now we're kind of, what period are we getting into now after the Imperial?
We're in the mid-80s, and we're heading towards that point where the relationship between she and Roger Claude ended because Roger died. But we're getting to the close of that point. She and Roger are pretty much the kings of Oxford Street. They are, and just to pick up on your point too, they were pretty damn brave in those days to open a gay or a lesbian nightclub in Sydney when the New South Wales Police Force weren't exactly the most welcoming people. Dawn and Roger were never too keen on paying bribes, so to stay open. So it was an interesting balancing act.
Which is incredible in itself, because everyone else in Sydney is paying a bribe, and for Dawn and Roger not to do that and be outwardly queer orientated is pretty impressive.
Maybe it's because I'm terrified of her. Abe Safra once said to me that the only person in the world who terrified him was Dawn. And it wasn't because she was violent. She just came up with ideas that scared the crap out of him. That she said, can you fund this? And I think, no. Get this woman out. I think the coppers may have actually just decided to stay away from them. They were hard to deal with. And I mean, and I think there are probably a few people who knew Dawn. She could actually be an incredibly strong, loyal friend. Yeah. But Jesus Christ, you wouldn't mess with her either.
And do you think that that's what kind of, and this is probably something for questions as well, if anyone's got a statement, because I'd love to hear people's thoughts on this. Do you think that's one of the things that allowed Sydney to pioneer itself into becoming one of the gayest cities in the world, is that they had almost this I keep using the idea of the patron lesbian saint of gays as this figurehead of kind of power and...
Yeah, I think it's one of the compelling reasons. I mean, Sydney is the weirdest city in the world, from my view. It's the strangest place. There's nowhere else like it. You come home and you think, back in town, there's graft, there's corruption, there's all sorts of wonderful things happening. It's so murky. It hasn't changed since the MacArthurs were running the shows back in 1800s. Early 1800s. The place is run core personified. It hasn't changed. All you do is change the surname. And that's a perfect melting pot for these sort of people. So someone like Dawn will come here, see it, prosper, be brave, and also make a big quid out of it. So and Sydney became a draw card for everyone. You know, kids from Adelaide, from Perth, from Canberra.
Yeah.
The whole nation came to Sydney because it was a sanctuary if you were different.
And I think
that helped.
We've talked about in the past the idea of the coat sign being the beacon for lost children. I definitely know that Oxford Street is the beacon for lost gays, and you go through that time where you discover that magical street where you can be whatever you want. Interestingly enough, that change, like obviously the first step of gentrification is get the gays in. It's amazing that like we've talked about how she then moved into the inner west in order to follow that movement, because that was the next stage.
Yeah, that's the next one. But Darlinghurst, Paddington, blah, 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 were gentrifying fast. The real estate profits, the real estate values are going through the roof really quickly. I still remember immediately after the 87 crash, about a year or two later, there were people brawling at auctions to bid on the house, and a house you wouldn't want to live in unless you spent a lot of money on it. So the affluence just spiked around here. The inner west was the next best thing. Again, close to the city, close to all the transport we needed, yada, yada, yada. Lots of old industrial buildings, lots of old housing for people that used to work in those factories. It was cheap, it was accessible, and it was also a place where you could build that community. And Dawn was incredibly astute. And I think the Newtown Hotel was the first business she got stuck into out there. And again, incredibly profitable, and the community tended to build around that. It was paid as a beacon in the community, I think, for them. So a lot of people who couldn't afford to live around here or just found it was possibly a little bit too snobbish, the Darlinghurst guys as opposed to the Newtown guys. There was a sort of bit of a demarcation dispute occasionally. Yeah, and then you had the Balmain ones, which were really intriguing.
They don't exist. There's no Balmain guys. There's actually nothing over the other side of the bridge. This is the Truman Show.
No, seriously. Town Hall Hotel, Balmain.
What?
Oh, yes.
Please tell me more about these Balmain gays.
We did an adventure up Sunday night adventure. No. It was still when Balmain was a bit interesting as well before it became Basket Weaver Central. And I still remember getting out there. It must have been the late 80s. We got out there, wandered into the pub, and going out from Darlinghurst. We're going to see how the other half lived. And I wander in. There's a rather large wolfie in a dress behind the bar, and I just walked up and, as normally, a Gordon's and tonic, dear, and the barmaid said, "It's up the fucking Regent." So at that point I thought, maybe I'm not a Balmain person. So we scuttled back to Darlinghurst as quickly as possible.
So, all right. I think we're going off course a little bit, so let's go back to the decaying relationship between Dawn and Roger.
Well, Roger and Dawn. Roger in the mid-80s was one of the earlier people to contract HIV, and he's okay. He made it through quite well until 1990, and that's when things, and we're heading up to a break by the way, I think. Yeah. In early 1990, Roger is crook. He knows that he's going to die, because in those days, if you were HIV positive, the only thing that would save you was in fact living long enough to find a cure. And that didn't come till about 1996, and even then it wasn't a cure, but it was close. 1990, Roger is unwell. He's having some good periods, some bad periods. HIV is one of those challenging things that there is a period where you think you're going to die, and then all of a sudden you lift back up again and you get the glimmer of hope, which of course is then dashed shortly afterwards. That's why the bastard of the disease. Roger is holding court. Roger was living in his Sutherland Street, Paddington house, which I always thought was a combination of sort of a little bit of Palazzo Versace Gold Coast, a little bit of Palace of Versailles, and a hell of a lot of Nick Scarley. It had pretty much everything. It looked as though, and at one stage it looked as though he'd plundered the subcontinent. It was busy. Some design magazines in the 80s absolutely loved it. They waxed lyrical over Roger's exquisite taste and these magnificent objets d'art, many of which, of course, weren't real, they were just fakes. But, Roger could pull it off.
Are we talking like Trump Tower?
Good point, yes.
Like that level of, cherub gold.
That one originally in New York.
That level of class.
Yeah, right. The Trump International, you walk in there and think, oh, God. Yeah, if Roger could have fitted another animal skin or a Louis XIV chair, he would have been happy. And Roger had this really cruel game. I thought it was cruel anyway. He'd have his ex-lovers and close friends at the dining table, and the game Roger liked to play was, I'm going to give you so much when I die, and if you're nicer to me, I'll give you a bit more, and all this sort of stuff. Play one off against the other. It was a pretty unpleasant pleasant thing to do. And a lot of the people around that dining table were also in early to mid stages of having HIV positive, so the money he was holding out to them as a bit of a carrot gave them hope that they'd at least have some comfort, because a lot of them didn't have a quid. And in the middle of all this was Roger's reasonably recently acquired boyfriend, Ludwig Gertsch, who someone said Roger liked because he was the chief cook and bottle washer. At about the age of 35, 36, Roger got Ludwig to get a licence so Ludwig could drive him everywhere, so he had a chauffeur do his duties. Ludwig was a hairdresser. I think he had a salon in Redfern, and at one stage had been a go-go boy. Anyway, so Ludwig was being tortured, as were the friends by Roger. Then in April 1990, Roger had a dinner party with a couple of his close friends who he didn't play games with, and they'd been arranging a trip to France for Bastille Day. Roger was in good form, he was feeling healthy, he knew he was in a honeymoon period. He was planning everything. The next couple of months were going to be big. The next morning, Roger was dead.
And that's where we'll leave it.
Oh.
Yeah. So we're going to have a little break. This is the time now to restock your glasses. For those playing at home, do what you need to do, use the bathroom, but we'll be back very shortly. slowly fading out. Oh my god, never ending story, it just ended.
There'll be a blow to them.
So I'm gonna still dawdle a little bit because we've got some things to do. I'm not gonna stress myself out because I sweated really bad last time I did that. But while we're waiting for the next bit to start and some drinks to come out, I just want to say thank you to the City of Sydney for all the support that they've given us. We got these lights, and the sound that you're hearing tonight has come through generous support from City of Sydney grant matching. Yeah, give them a clap. Everyone, when I opened a bar, everyone's like, the City of Sydney sucks, everyone hates them. And then you meet the city and they're they're the only people that do anything that you want. You talk to builders, you talk to licensing doesn't talk back for 6 months, and then the City of Sydney is like, do you want us to call them? And I'm like, yeah. They've been really supportive throughout COVID and throughout the entire kind of journey of Dulcie's. So without them, we could never really be at the point that we are. So thank you to them. I don't know if I've got spies in the audience to them, but hopefully it reports back. Secondly, I hope everyone's got questions and pieces of paper. Yeah, everyone's got those. If you've got any statements, if you've got any memories or things that you can reminisce about, please write those down as well, because we started these things essentially because I really like hearing other people's stories, and I would love to hear, I was just talking to Frank before about that period in queer culture before the 60s, and that kind of quiet sophistication of gentlemen parties and things like that. And it's kind of amazing the stories you kind of connect with when you really sit down and start talking to people at a bar, which funnily enough you're in right now. So I'd always recommend during these times to reach out to the people around you and to Duncan or myself, I don't know much, but anyone else around who may have a skerrick of interest in similar things, and talk to them about it, because that's essentially what hospitality is, and we can't afford to lose that. And I think after COVID, we all kind of went through this period of being trapped in our houses. I know my boyfriend did. I didn't, because I had to run a bar and do takeaway cocktails. But everyone else I knew was kind of trapped in a house, and kind of I watched how people lost a connection with each other. And for me, I've seen a loss of connection with people at bars for years, and I've been in hospitality for 14 years, and I had this reality where people come in and sit down and they only socialize with themselves, and they're very scared of talking to the person next to them at the bar. And I think after COVID, that all started to change, and I think we're in a really good point as local humans. Maybe it's not around the world. It's definitely not in Melbourne. Too soon. Their numbers are down. They're fine now. But there's an ability for people to be able to sit and talk at a bar and really connect with the humans that they share a space with. There's a reason you're all in this room today, and that's enough of a reason to have a talk with someone about things. I love that, and that's why I have a bar, and I decided to sell people drinks and more drinks so that they can have the ability to have really good conversations. We've had some crazy ones in here. We've had some really demure ones. We've seen people pushed off chairs over their politics. And we've seen people meet each other and have really amazing relationships. So that's up to you guys to see how you want to ride the night, I guess. I'm drinking a margarita. I actually don't know why I told you that, but I hope I can almost be ready to start talking. Yes? I can't see you. Can someone just say yes? Yeah, great. Okay, thanks. Okay, so we're going back to Roger.
We're back to murder.
We are back to murder. I want you to give me a brief introduction to Roger and how the man he is, because he is a bit more colourful than what we've actually let on so far.
Mixed bag on Roger. A number of people have spoken to me and said they loved Roger. He was delightful, charming, urbane, blah, blah, blah. I had a few dealings with him, and I just thought he was up himself, as I mentioned earlier. Quite a remarkable figure around Sydney when I knew him. He was well into his middle age by then. He would sweep into restaurants wearing a flowing caftan, lots of bling, and sandals, tanned to the point of being a little over tanned, I think. He'd been cooked a little bit too long. This was in the day, but it wasn't fake tan, it was just grilling.
Full leather bag it.
Yeah, it was just, or usually with a couple of flunkies. If he'd had one of those little whisks, fly, you wouldn't be at all surprised.
Is anyone else lost at what that is?
Oh, you know,
What is a whisk?
if you've seen those old movies set in the Middle East or in Southeast Asia somewhere, where the potentate arrives and he's got a whisk that gets rid of flies and bugs and things.
Oh, yeah.
Roger was terribly, terribly grand. He was a walking Louis XIV chair.
Yeah.
And as we were talking about earlier, his house was that. Some would call him flamboyant. If it was a matter for him, he was what he was, so you accept it. He was also an incredibly hard-nosed businessman. He was as hard-nosed as Dawn was, except Dawn was a little bit more earthy. Dawn you could have a conversation with, and she'd go through the numbers with you. Roger sort of walked in, swept around the room, and swept out again.
That's really interesting you say that, because we touched on a mutual friend of ours recently. I'm not going to mention her name because I always forget cameras rolling. He was talking about Roger, and he really loved Dawn, and the way that Dawn was like a bit of a human in the way that she interacted, and she was always very real, and she was always kind of there, and she, like you, and he, like you, had described the fact that she had this massive chain of keys that allowed access to everything she owned. Whereas with Roger, it was, I don't want to say the way that I interact in this bar, but he was very like flippant, and he would swan in, and it was more for appearances rather than...
He was grand.
Yeah.
Everything was on stage for Roger. Whereas Dawn, you're right, Dawn was extremely down to earth. There was no bullshit with Dawn whatsoever. I mean, she was short, squat, steel cut hair. I mean, she didn't go to a barber, but she should have. She loved wearing denim. She dressed like a bloke. And she had this massive set of keys which would open the door to everything I think she owned, which was quite a lot of properties in those days, and possibly doors to a few places that she didn't own, but that's Dawn. She was extraordinarily hands-on every breath of the business, whereas Roger wasn't. Roger was making lots of money, he had people in place, so he could sit at the top of the lofty pyramid. And that was a big difference I always found between the two of them. You could have a chat with Dawn, Roger, maybe not. Roger would listen if he chose to. Dawn would always spend time. She was, as I said before, she would have made a good politician because she remembered who you are, she remembered your story, and she would talk to you. And it was always that. She was particularly clever at that. And Roger played these games, which I thought, with his will, which I thought was just really quite offensive. You don't do that to people at all, and particularly don't do it to people who have an expectation of getting some comfort as they're getting sicker. I thought it was pretty cruel myself, but that's just me. The day Roger died was, as I said, he has his friends round for dinner. Denise Cousins, I think her name was, who was running King's Steam in Oxford Street, which is still there, different name, same business. Incredibly lucrative, pure cash business back in those days too. There wasn't a credit card inside. Signed in using someone else's name, or a name you made up on the way through. Lots of Mickey Mouses went in. Pay your money, go and do whatever you chose to do, and then leave. Fantastic business in the 80s and 90s.
I think it still is.
Could be.
Actually, side note. Currently, Sydney sauna, this is what I don't experience, but someone in this room knows quite well. It is... No, it's not Duncan. Apparently it's the only place in Sydney that you can dance at the moment, because it's a sex on premises venue. Granted, you're dancing in a towel, however, they're keeping the dream alive of gay nightclubs. So if you ever want to go, ladies, you'll have to stay at home. Gentlemen, you're free to dance wherever and however you want. Get it out, get weird.
It's prompted a memory too. Dawn actually opened, I think, probably the world's first lesbian bathhouse. It didn't last long. I just doing a bit of research this up, just trying to think, oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, apparently she opened a lesbian bathhouse.
With a car park full of U-Hauls out the front.
Yeah, Ken's Karate Club, a famous establishment in Kensington for gentlemen, also had a lesbian night, but apparently my recollection was I only had one.
Anyway,
all
right.
I digress.
Roger's dead.
Let's move on. So Roger goes to bed, a happy man, looking forward to a trip to Paris. His friends think everything's great. Roger is looking up. He's positive. He's happy. Blah blah blah. He goes to bed, and then the next morning he is dead. Oddly enough, when the friends arrive to see Roger lying in state, and the doctor for that matter. They note that his bed is very, very neat, and Roger apparently slept in a complete confusion of blankets and dangles and pillows, and they're quite concerned that Roger's in repose very neatly, like he's been propped there. But back in those days, the doctor turns up and certifies, he's dead. Back in those days, there was no such thing as a post-mortem for a person suffering with HIV. The morgue staff were so utterly terrified, as were the general public, pretty much back in 1990, of catching something from this still quite mysterious disease, that post-mortems weren't performed. So if your body was taken into the morgue and you're an HIV sufferer, unless you had a sort of bullet hole or a stab mark or an axe in the back of your head, it was just said, congratulations, see you later, no post-mortem whatsoever. Cause of death, natural causes, see you later. And that's what happened to Roger Claude. A couple of days later at the reading of the will, which is done in the Paddington Salon, by the way, for extra drama rather than a bland solicitor's office.
This is very Liberace.
It is actually, yes. The solicitor, his recently acquired solicitor, a guy called Brian Roberts. Brian Roberts whips out the will, which is recently executed about 2 weeks beforehand. So this is Roger's latest. And everyone sitting around the table expected, they're thinking that there's an $8 million estate about to be divvied up. The estate was substantial. There's about 2.7 million that they could trace. There may have been a few other bucks somewhere else.
And that's assets, cash, everything?
Yeah, that's the whole lot. Anticipated and always bragged about was, I'm worth about $8 million. He was worth a little over a quarter of that. Still not a bad chunk of change in 1990. And instead of all the expectant beneficiaries, friends, ex-lovers, the housekeeper, getting a chunk of change, they were found that the new will cut them out almost completely. One, Eduardo, long-term friend of a long-term ex-lover of Roger's, Eduardo picked up about $10,000, expecting another zero on the end at least. Most of the estate went to Ludwig Gertsch, the hairdresser come go-go boy, factotum, the poor bugger who'd been putting up with Roger for a couple of years. All the long-term friends and lovers turned on Ludwig, thinking the arrivals had picked up all the cash. So the room went very, very quiet, very, very cold, very, very fast. Ludwig, of course, is as happy as he possibly could be. He'd suddenly had all this money. In the background of all this is why Roger died early. Now, the murky rumours started coming up that Dr. Tontine had made a late night arrival. Roger had been plied, and back in those days...
What's Dr. Tontine?
Well, Dr. Tontine, the sort of non-allergenic pillow.
Tontine pillow.
Oh,
Yes.
an old person.
Yeah. Let me fluff your pillows.
Right, I get it now.
And back at that particular time, HIV patients were just prescribed as many drugs as they wanted. There wasn't a lot of sort of, this could be a bit dangerous. So Roger, one suggestion was that he'd been poleaxed by medication completely. And then Dr. Tontine had interceded, and that was the end of Roger.
Dr. Tontine's a pillow.
Dr. Tontine is a pillow. These days I suppose you call it a Sheridan, perhaps.
Yeah, a pillow.
Yeah, anyway.
Dr. Pillow.
Anyway, I'll pass on. And that was there. So that was the end of Roger. Years later, when they had an inquest into his death, David Cooper, who was the head of immunology up at St Vincent's, made some quip, almost a quip for David Cooper anyway, that Roger was expected to die, but he died well ahead of schedule. Eventually the coroner came back, I think, years later at the second coronial inquest saying Rogers was probably bumped off.
But that's the vibe I go with.
That's the vibe. Roger may have met with misfortune that night, but you know.
I think he was killed.
Yeah, I think so
Privately.
too. Yeah, well, there was a lot of money around at the time. Anyway, so Ludwig, in his widow's weeds, he mourns for a sufficient amount of time, then it's party on. As Ludwig is running around town suddenly with this great estate sweeping before him, and all these ex-lovers looking at him thinking, threats start coming up, he's getting nasty phone calls, he's becoming slightly terrified of what the consequences might be. However, that's not stopping his partying, and he's motoring along. I think he had a white Ford Capri.
Good car.
The convertible.
Better car.
It's a look. It's a look. I think Simone had one as well, so she could so you could get the hairstyle into it. Anyway, he's cruising along through Palmer Street, and he sees there's on the corner of Palmer Street and Burton Street, there's a housing commission building. And at the time it was being knocked up, and one of the builders' labourers was a bloke called Vince Esposito, who some people might know. And Vince, in his early 20s, was pretty bloody striking to look at. So I think Ludwig saw the stubby crack and nearly ploughed into a telegraph pole. Vince at this stage, we would describe as...
That's not a euphemism.
No.
Ploughed into a telegraph pole.
Ooh, oops. Anyway, moving along. Vince at that stage has moved from being unhappily married and with 2 kids that he adores and living in Rose Bay in a rented property. Vince, by the way, his background was he grew up in Western Sydney, Mount Druitt, I think from memory, in a 3-bedroom house with 16 children in it.
Can you fucking believe that?
Yeah.
I had this last time, I was
Yeah.
like, take a breath.
I can't even get a... I've spoken to him about this, and he can't even quite describe... I think they were just racked up in bedrooms.
That poor woman.
Well, they didn't have television. And neither parents spoke English, so no SBS.
So I have 16 kids it is.
Apparently Dad managed to punt quite comfortably. His command of English wasn't great, but he could pick a horse, the wrong one. So the kids were all put out to work. As soon as they were old enough to get a job that would bring back cash, the kids were all put out to work. Vince escaped all that, married, settled down in Rose Bay in an apartment. And one Sunday night, shortly after Ludwig had first spotted him, he goes to the Aubrey for his first look around in Oxford Street. And he's in the lounge bar of the Aubrey, or the piano bar. And Ludwig is there. And Ludwig spots him, makes a beeline across the room to him, remembering what he'd glimpsed earlier in Palmer Street. And offers to buy him a drink. Vince doesn't know what's going on. Toe is just literally just touching the water. Ludwig is very persuasive and bats on for a while, and they end up having an uncomfortable relationship. Vince wants a friendship and he wants to look around gay Sydney. Ludwig thinks he's about to get married again to be one of the best looking blokes in Sydney. So it's not going terribly well. He showers him with gifts. He gets a car, he gets this, he gets lavish birthday parties, has dinners, blah, blah, blah. It's an uncomfortable relationship because Ludwig is actually full on and Vince is almost in reverse. One of the saving graces of the relationship was that Ludwig has a genuine passion for Vince's 2 kids. They get on fabulously. He's great with them. So that's the sort of bond that kept them together pretty well. Fast forward through to October, Sleaze Ball weekend. Sleaze Ball back in those days, and I've forgotten about this, Sleaze Ball was actually 2 weeks after the long weekend, which was really pretty dumb when you think about it because, quite frankly, everyone was so trashed they couldn't have got up on Monday anyway.
That's like this weekend. This is Sleaze Ball weekend.
Yeah, the weekend of the 19th of October.
Yeah. Does everyone know what Sleaze Ball was? Raise your hand. These two do. Respect. Do many other people?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, no.
Like-
Work there.
Yeah, Sleaze Ball seemed to be. I miss Sleaze Ball. Like the last Sleaze Ball that came in, I was like, no, I think I'm gonna sit this one out. Stupid mistake. Like it seems a vibe. It was for those playing at home. Sleaze Ball was the moneymaker for Sydney Mardi Gras, and it was their main fundraiser for the Mardi Gras party.
Yep. And it was a bacchanal.
Yeah, which means a lot of sex and drugs and fun.
Yeah. I was the only one at the bar buying drinks.
I don't believe these stories anymore.
No, this one is true. This one is true.
I work behind the bar and I can concur.
Thank you. I asked for the wine list and got a very strange look on myself. Heineken. I thought, oh, that'll do. Anyway, yeah, so there you go. So anyway, this weekend, and Ludwig had got, his friends had come up from Melbourne, back when you could. Sorry.
It's apparently too soon.
Yeah.
For those jokes.
Damn, we're forging ahead. The house was full of his mates. That Friday night, it was I think the Friday the 19th of October, he gets a call, he goes out to visit Vince. Vince by that stage is living in Frederick Street, Ashfield, in a sort of mediocre 2-bedroom apartment, red brick, blah, 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 near an Armco fence as I recall. He's living out there, he's got his kids for the weekend, Ludwig wants to see them, so he comes out, blah, blah, blah. That's the story we heard. the story goes on to say that they had a blue, which is not uncommon, and Ludwig, in a fit of pique, rings his solicitor, Brian Roberts, and says, can you come and pick me up? Now, why he never called a cab? Interesting. Anyway, Brian Roberts turns up, and Brian Roberts is the last man, allegedly, to see Ludwig. He says he takes him from the scene of the argument in Ashfield, drives him all the way through the city, and drops him on the corner of Palmer Street and Oxford Street around about 9:15 or something or other that Friday night. Ludwig disappears. On the Saturday morning, Brian makes a couple of quips to a friend saying they'll never see him again. But at that stage, no one really knows that Ludwig is missing. Saturday grinds on, everyone's getting ready for the party. Ludwig still hasn't turned up. His friends from up for the weekend, who were any gay person would in those days, just went to the party anyway. Sunday afternoon, and all his close coterie of friends are very concerned. So Brian Roberts and one of the others goes to Paddington Police Station to report Ludwig missing. This is where something really strange happens. The woman who went with him to the police station says that as Brian is talking to the coppers about Ludwig, he starts describing Ludwig's interesting sexual preferences, which included being tied up, bashed up, and all that sort of stuff, which she thought wasn't quite Ludwig. He was very open with what he used to get up to. Nothing terribly spectacular. But Brian is weaving this tale of turgid, dark rooms, danger, something slightly evil, that whiff of menace in everything he did. And she's thinking, this is not the Ludwig we know. Also, over the next couple of days, Brian, even though Ludwig is missing, Brian starts using his power of attorney to move rather large chunks of money out of Ludwig's accounts.
Just to go back on the conversation with the police, I think it's really interesting to note as well that this is a point in time where there is no glow, there is no police support for queer people, and I think they're still turning a blind eye to people being thrown off cliffs in ears and beaches.
Good, you should mention that. Because, and it's an excellent point, because after a couple of days and heiress missing, the detectives get involved. The detective in charge of the case, who happened to be at Paddington at the time, is a bloke called Ken Bowditch. Ken was the gentleman who had investigated the disappearance of Ross Warren, the young newsreader, the year beforehand. Actually, 18 months beforehand, Ross had gone missing from Marks Park, obviously set upon and thrown over. The investigation, I think the coroner was a little bit more scathing than lacklustre. And Ken reprised that investigation into looking into the disappearance of Ludwig Gertsch. He and his task force spent a lot of time delving into the bowels of Oxford Street clubs, but at no time did they think to go out to visit Frederick Street, Ashfield, which is, policing 101. A very simple thing is when you have a report of a crime, you go back to where it probably started and you work your way forward. It'd be like going to a murder scene, not going to a murder scene. It's bizarre. And no one could actually quite fathom why they did this. Instead, they focused their investigation on looking around Oxford Street, posters on buildings. Bowditch, at one stage, went into one of the bathhouses and was astounded, so astounded that he gave an interview to a journalist saying what people got up to in bathhouses was extraordinary. I wish they had one for straight blokes. And he described...
In Sydney sauna.
Ooh, that's good. And then in the course of this interview, he described Ludwig as, I don't want to speak ill of him, but he was, quote, a crazy little faggot. And thought, this is going well. And this is before we knew how lousy the investigation into Ross Warren's disappearance was. The consequence of that is the investigation goes precisely nowhere. A couple of weeks later, Ludwig's body is found wrapped in a cheap doona in Winmalee in the lower Blue Mountains. He'd been strangled. All of a sudden, it becomes a murder investigation, but still no one visits the potential crime scene in Ashfield. Later, they discover that Vince when they eventually get there, ages later, they find that the carpet in one of the bedrooms has been removed. Vince comes up with a not terribly convincing story that the carpet had been removed by him because one of his boys threw up on it.
As you do.
As you do.
Just rip that carpet up and replace it.
Things progress. It's getting interesting. Come up to Christmas 1990. I'm at home doing some stuff. And I got a phone call late in the afternoon from Dawn. I haven't heard from her in years. Love, can you talk to me? I've got something to tell you. I need a hand. I said, okay, yeah, whenever. Down. Fine. So I wandered down to Hanover's coffee shop, which is in Oxford Street, which is Bentwood Chair's lousy coffee, and sort of old Vienna, even though it was Hanover. We weren't good on geography those days. Dawn wanders in, keys, denim, the whole kit, and she says, "I think the coppers are going to lock me up for Ludwig's murder." I said, "Oh God, why would you think that?" "Oh, I've been tipped." And I thought, "Oh yeah, she's been bribing someone in the inquiry." And she's absolutely beside herself. She says to me, she's had nothing to do with it. She may be profiteering from it, but she's had absolutely nothing to do with the murder. And she said, "I've got this red hot tip." And I said to her, "The reason you've got a red hot tip is one of the coppers who you may or may not have been bribing has in fact probably trying to rev you up to get some more money." Oh. The thing was that Dawn had no involvement whatsoever in what happened, but what Dawn did in classic Dawn fashion was at the moment the will was read, she moved in on the beneficiaries to get as much as she could and control. And the beneficiary of Ludwig's will was Vince. Vince got pretty much most of the money out of the will, which included businesses, cash, all that sort of stuff. Dawn realised that Vince won't mind me mentioning that Vince is not the most astute person. He's just an average bloke who's got no business experience whatsoever. He's not stunningly clever. He's just an average sort of human being. So Dawn thinks, you need someone to manage all the money for you. So Dawn assists quickly in the management of the money, aided by Brian Roberts, the solicitor. They both do quite well out of this. From memory, Brian, I may have this wrong, Brian pulled certainly about $800,000 or $900,000 out of the estate. Dawn suggested that Vince invest in something called the Newtown Gym, and Vince thinks this is great. I got my own gym, this is fabulous. Turns up one morning, puts his key in the door, and the key doesn't work. Vince no longer owns a gym, Dawn does. Yeah, it doesn't miss a beat anyway. A couple of years later, the police still haven't had any luck, and there are wonderful stories running around Sydney at the time that Ludwig was murdered by a jealous lover. That didn't work. There's a great story that he was actually hit by a couple of off-duty police officers doing it for money. So the whole thing is as murky as all get out, and still no one's been arrested for the murder. There are still no suspects. We still believe Brian Roberts' story that he'd been dumped. Then Brian Roberts gets arrested by the police after a lengthy fraud investigation. The will in which Vince was beneficiary is a fake. Brian goes to jail for about 4 years from memory. Bizarrely enough, and I forgot about this earlier, shortly after Ludwig's poor mum has gone down to the police station to collect his belongings that they've taken from the body, things like key rings and wallet and all that sort of stuff, she steps in front of a train at McDonaldtown. She lives in Redfern. And no one can work out what the hell happened that night. She's actually gone down one station and taken a step in front of a train. No one knows why. It's just one of those utterly bizarre circumstances that we can't explain. Yep. No. Yeah. I've thought about it. It was someone on the other side of the train saying, "Hey, come on."
So would there be any reason for her to be pushed in front of a train or step in front of a train?
Well, possibly. Yeah. Money is always, in any murder, passion is second, money always comes first in my book. So there may have been some sort of question of someone thinking they could benefit by mum dying, because they think at that point mum was the natural beneficiary under the old will, not the new will.
Right.
Very complicated. Poor old Vince is oblivious to all this. He's still sticking to his story that he had a blue with Ludwig and last saw him wave goodbye on the night of the 19th. Years and years later, and nothing much has happened. The police finally reinvestigate the case in about 2003-2004. And a mate of mine was Vince's solicitor, and Vince turns up one day on his doorstep. He's just got the subpoena to appear at the new coroner's inquest. And my mate Alex, who practices just down the road.
That's 14 years later.
Yeah, nothing has happened. Two of the great unsolved murders of Sydney have been remained unsolved.
And we both talked about them here. Juanita.
Yeah, another one to add to it. I suppose before I forget at this point too, one of the weird things about the Ludwig Gertsch murder was it brought New South Wales police to focus on the fact that there might have been a series of gay-related crimes around Sydney One detective thought that might be the case. And he actually finally started investigating the murders at Bondi, the murders at Waterloo, and a few other joints around town, thinking that there was a consensus, that there were groups of young blokes trying to kill gay men. That was brought to him because he was working on the Ludwig Gertsch case. The great quirk of one of these things is that the Ludwig Gertsch case had absolutely nothing to do with gay hate crimes. It was a crime about money, old-fashioned murder. But it did finally stimulate some interest in something that percolated for years before it finally became a serious issue. Serious for us, but not serious publicly. The coppers tried to avoid it for years. There was quite a curious nexus.
Those pesky gays wanting not to die.
Yeah. And we got really narky in about 2007 and really caused some trouble. And we've been causing it ever since.
That's what we do.
Yeah. Anyway.
Going back to just the idea of the reopening of the case, what happens there? If he's been subpoenaed...
Again, the strange, weird things about murder. The case is reopened because Brian Roberts' wife, they're having a massive divorce dispute. His daughter has died, tragic circumstances. And his wife is getting really grumpy with him. And Brian says something along the lines to her, I'm the one responsible for her death. I think she committed suicide or something like that. I'm the one responsible, and for Ludwig as well. Something like that. The wife thinks, aha, and tells the coppers. The coppers think, aha, we may have a reason. So the coppers then start investigating, and they do a bloody good job this time. They finally go to the crime scene, so almost 2 decades later. About 14 to 15 years later, they go to the crime scene. By that stage, forensics forget about it. But they've done a comprehensive job, and they've got enough to go to the coroner and say, this needs to be reopened, and I think there are some people who are persons of interest. Poor old Vince, who's been terrified for the last 15 or so years, goes to his solicitor mate and says, here's the real story, and I'll paraphrase here. I was told to take the 2 kids out for the night and not come back until late. I was threatened. I was absolutely terrified for my life and that of my kids and even my ex-wife. I was so scared. And I haven't told anyone a thing other than the script I was told to follow. So this all goes before the coroner's court. Ludwig tells his story. Things get very murky at the coroner's court by that stage. We've got the history of Brian Roberts, the dodgy will, his imprisonment, Vince finally coming clean about his version of events. The coroner comes down with the findings, says, basically recommending that there is a known person might be looked at by the Director of Public Prosecutions to prosecute them for murder. And of course nothing happened. I chatted to chase them up years later and they said something along the lines of, oh, it's a bit old now, we don't think we'll get a success, so we're not going to pursue it. Which they do on occasions as well. I think it's one of the great travesties because I've spoken to Vince's lawyer, who's intimately involved in the case, and he's an ex-prosecutor himself, and he said, this case is worth a strong run. It is a good brief of evidence worth taking to court. But the sad thing about this story is it still remains unresolved, and that was in 2016. I had a chat with the DPP. 4 years later, I understand the New South Wales are reviewing it. New South Wales Police are reviewing the case yet again. I hope they arrest somebody.
Well, yeah, like what do you do now? Like who is the next, these are the questions you can ask. What's the end result? Is Brian Roberts still...
Brian Roberts has changed his name slightly. He's still around, he's still upright.
Anyway,
I'll leave that one there.
That's, yeah, and this...
I would hasten to add at this point too, we also go back to that old story about the allegation that 2 police officers were inveigled to do the murder. There was also just another weird one. Another bloke popped his head up and said, I'd been hired to go into the house and kill Ludwig, but I was arrested for breaking and entering before I got there.
No,
different house entirely.
He was busy that
He was
night.
quite happy to chat about it. So it's a convoluted murder.
So, judging by what you've said so far, Vince has lured him to the house in some way. Vince and the kids aren't there.
No, they were at the gelato bar in Bondi.
Anita's or Messina? Anita's is better.
Oh,
Just
no.
go to Anita's.
It was the old gelato, but the original one.
On the corner.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was also good.
Bit of high Hungarian.
So they're not there, which means the idea that the two police officers met. I'm just surmising what I've understood.
Brian Roberts also has has some physical impairments, which make it very tricky for him to be responsible.
So he's been killed at Vince's house.
Yep.
That's why and then the body's been picked up and taken somewhere else and dumped.
There's
The trip to Oxford Street never happened. The carpet has been ripped up in the room that he was supposedly murdered in, replaced because the kid vomited in it after the murder, I'm assuming. And then that's where it's at.
Yeah, and no forensics at all. Eyewitness accounts are at best well-intentioned but not accurate. So it does have some tricks, and the older it gets, the harder it gets.
All right.
Welcome to Gay Sydney.
This is you actually got there's so much more information in this one than the last one, so you guys got the good session. We're gonna leave it on that. Ask your questions. We'll go through. I'll collect all the questions up, and then we'll do a question and answer session in the next bit. But give Duncan a clap just for that, because that seems like it was a. All right. We will see you soon. Just trying to time that so I had music at the right time, but I didn't. So good for me. Enjoy. before we get Duncan back on the stage, he's going to still have a little bit of a break, and we've got martinis being made. But I do want to talk to, and we don't have to put this on the live stream if you don't want to. But you've got some cool stories you want to talk about, Dawn. You're just not mic'd for the live stream. But have a chat.
Thank you. My name's Judy. I knew Dawn for about 10 or 15 years, quite a long time ago. I just want to put one thing right. Where Capricio's was, it's not where the boys said. It's, they said between Stonehouse and the courthouse, Stonewall and the courthouse. It was actually the other side. There's a place called Fraser and Hughes that used to make Cook's uniforms.
Yeah.
It's above there. And it's now back to being a nightclub again, but that's where it was. Now, Capricio's was owned by a fella called Tommy, and that was the only gay joint in Oxford Street that Dawn didn't own. And it did very well. And she was very upset, so she decided to buy it. And Tommy wouldn't sell it to her. So it burnt down.
Yeah, but
That was the end of Capricio's, and it's the only one she didn't own. So from then on, she owned every place in Oxford Street because Capricio's had gone. Ruby Red's was the gay club for girls, and in Crown Street, which is now above the bottle shop. And even though I'm happily married to this bloke here for 50 years, I used to go to Ruby Red's quite a lot. So one night I said to him, why don't you come with me? He said, okay. So us and another couple went along. But unfortunately, it was the same night that the bikies from Penrith had decided they were going to come and raid Ruby Red's and see what all these dykes get up to. So we had no security at Ruby Red's. So up come the bikies up the stairs. Do you think my husband saved me? He and his mate got behind the fridge. Behind the bar.
best place to be when you're fucking being stormed by a group of bikies with lesbians around. That's where I'd
And
go.
all us girls, we got hold of the bikies and we threw them down the stairs. Meanwhile, the whole of Crown Street was closed. There was police everywhere. And the girls won and the bikies were taken away.
We knew that though. Like, that's why Dykes on Bikes ride the front of the parade, because they clear the street of all the heterosexual detritus.
The bikies
I love you people, you're great.
never came back. Just one other small thing. When I used to do quite a bit of work for Dawn. When she built the tall sheds, she had two here on Oxford Street, but she also had another one in Newtown. And that was the first tall shed she built, which I had quite a lot to do with getting that set up. And she used to pay me with a cheque from Bradbury Laundry. I never ever found out what Bradbury Laundry was, but that's where all my wages came from. And she used to try and get me to do all her books, and I could see how shady they were, and I thought, no, I'm not getting involved in this. So I opted out of it. Just one small thing. My husband imports electronics, and Dawn saw some of the nightclubs we'd done, which was including Studio 66 in Rose Bay, for those of you who remember, and the Cauldron and Rogues. And Dawn came to us and said, they are the best amps I've ever seen. I've just bought the Exchange Hotel. Can you please do the sound system? So we put these amps into there, and we were invited to the opening, which was like dunnies hanging from the ceiling and potties, and Robert was there, Robert Helpman was his little partner. One of the best nights we've ever had. So, yeah, that's all I'm prepared to say. There's lots of other stories, but they'll do. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, don't get you brought my martini. Fuck yeah. So, like, these are obviously the best parts about these nights, is that we get to talk to people and answer questions about what's going on and how people remember these people. One thing I will say going into this section is that this is a very, this is one person's or a couple of people's version of events. And whenever you look in history in retrospect, you've always got to remember that the people telling the story or talking about it have only ever seen it from a certain perspective. Your perspective might be different. You may have a different understanding of what it was like, and you may have more information than we do, or less. But you've got to remember, and this goes to people online as well, that everything is up to interpretation and the version of events that people were exposed to. So, yes. That's just a way of like me, like, disclaiming anything that I ever say.
Camera's off.
Wise move. Okay, so we're going to go into these questions. One of the things that was spoken about quite quickly was whatever happened to Dawn. I am happy to tell that story.
I think you should.
One of the most amazing, the reason that I really love it and love this whole story is that I was brought into a situation when I came into Sydney and grew into being a young gay person, where I was surrounded by a lot of older people who had lived in Sydney at a certain time and knew certain people. And one of the stories that they always talked about was the formidable funeral of Dawn O'Donnell and the repercussions that came from it. When Dawn was it cancer that took Dawn in the end?
Yes, I think ovarian cancer from memory.
Yeah, awful. And Dawn was went through a lot of pain while dying and was going through, and the relationship she had with her partner would have been quite stressed because of the cancer, and there would have been a situation where Dawn was dying and some things happened that Dawn probably wasn't 100% into, and the statement that I've always been told is when she re-signed her will just before her death, the statement was, "I made that princess and I'll break her," which I think presents a very clear understanding of how that will suddenly went. And after the funeral, everything kind of changed for the person in question, and I think they suddenly were very aware of how much they'd been cut out of that. Do you have anything to add to this?
Only that I think Nida got a lot of Australian artworks as part of the will, genuine Australian artworks, a bit like Roger Claude's genuine artworks, when some of them were fine, but others, you know, the Brett Whiteley's still a bit damp. Just been dead a few years.
It's wet. As Nida's hanging them up on the wall,
Yeah.
they're just a little bit wet to touch.
Yeah. It looks like in the style of. And the signature is in the style of as well.
So yeah, there was obviously quite a big contention over Dawn's assets and the things that she had and had spoken about. But I think that adds to the magic and the mystery of Dawn O'Donnell in the end, and the kind of the interest and mystery that she leaves. So I hope that's answered what happened to Dawn. But yeah, I think she went on to continue, and she did very well up until her death, really.
She was extraordinarily successful, and it was a hell of a funeral. I didn't go to it, I drove past, and a couple of months ago we were talking about Abe Saffron's funeral. It wasn't dissimilar. When Abe departed, they had this ceremony up at the temple up in Wallara, and I remember sitting down the back of it when the drag queens arrived at a very terribly formal Jewish service, and Abe wasn't all that formal. All the blokes are sitting on one side, the women are sitting on the other side. Blokes are all wearing yarmulkes, and then the drag queens arrive, Carmen, Carlotta, the whole lot, in big floral dresses and the most magnificent hats. And the attendant in this sort of grey uniform just looks at them and goes, And then he looks across at a few of us and he's saying,
Not knowing who to give the yarmulke to.
yeah, no yarmulke, no hats off. Ladies, after you. And Dawn's funeral was this enormously colourful group of people that gathered for it. It's wonderful.
Like, as it should. Like, these people should have, like, a state funeral of the Sydney's underworld and upper world. What are yours, Duncan's? Obviously, I'm too young to experience any of these. Favourite establishments of Dawn's, burnt or not?
I was never a great Dawn fan because I believe in a bar that I like to, if I'm going to a bar to get drunk, I'd like to get drunk reasonably quickly.
So for all those like at home, if you listen to the last talks, it's Bottoms Up bar that used to be in the ranks.
Yeah, the Bottoms Up was Thursday night, Macleay Street Bistro for a civilised dinner, then whip across the Bottoms Up bar for the stripper. I tended to avoid, I preferred the Aubrey. I was far more genteel.
Oh, the Aubrey sounds just stupidly incredible.
Spectacular.
Let's never talk about it again because I didn't get to experience
And
it.
Nanette, the owner, is still kicking around. I saw her motoring past in her old Mercedes pagoda roof the other day.
Oh, I want to talk to her. I wanted to come in here and do a... If she's online right now, come in, Nanette. Were you a detective during any of this time?
Most of it. From 77 through to 86, and I departed by the time Dawn rang me with some legal advice on her potential problem.
And you said one of the things that was not, that you missed out in this one is that you were the only person that ever visited Vince's house during the time.
Yeah, there was two of us. I went out there with a mate of mine from the Telegraph, Warren Owens, who I think is probably still one of the best crime reporters this country's ever had. And we thought, this is weird. no one's been out to the house. Let's go and have a look. And I remember standing there on the roadside thinking, murder, just a quick thing, murder is also about logistics. Can it happen the way it's been outlined? And we're looking at it thinking, there's no way known this could have happened the way it's been alleged. It just didn't work. The building was, the entrance and access to the building, the witnesses, blah, blah, blah. Nothing made sense. And that's where we first thought, this stinks.
And this goes back to another question that's been asked about what the forensics were on the Duna. Now, is this pre-forensics?
It's post the arrival of DNA, but it wasn't very commonly used. So back in those days, forget about DNA. The Duna cover, I vaguely recall someone suggested might have been pinched off the hills hoist, the back of the building.
Right.
And so there was nothing on it of any note apart from significant traces of Ludwig, who'd been wrapped in it for about 3 weeks before they found him. So forensics, zero.
Messy. All right.
Summer.
Going back to this reference of, and I'll only say it once because it's the dark word down here. When you worked for the Telegraph, you obviously have a lot of relationships that you have with the people in the know. For anyone who ever Googles anything about Sydney's crime history or any new articles about it, Duncan's name always appears in it, and I'm always waiting for it to one day be like, Duncan McNab did it. You won't ever find it. He just tells people who else did it. How do you maintain...
Or how to get away with it.
Yeah. How do you maintain your friendships or be so close with these kind of characters?
That's actually pretty easy. The only people who actually truly terrified me were members of the New South Wales Police. I always found the crooks are reasonable people. Well, old style crooks, God forbid I should use that expression. But yeah, there you go. They're reasonable people to deal with, and it's quite often you'll get together for a lunch and a chat, a couple of coppers, a couple of old crooks, have a laugh, have a giggle. The people I like are very honourable. They are criminals, yes, they break the law, they don't do anything terribly nasty, they don't sell drugs, that sort of stuff. They don't murder people. Some of them do armed robberies back in the old days, that's all right, it's fine.
What's an armed robbery?
Yeah, he didn't shoot anybody, so it's fine. This is the business, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon they've done 2 armed robberies, they go home, go to the pub and go home, have a normal life. It's what they did. It's old-fashioned criminals who did crime as their living. And they're all quite reasonable, they're honourable. They will tell you, they will tell you if a crook is doing something they believe is unreasonable. If, for example, they hear of someone who is perhaps involved in child pornography, that sort of stuff, God help the poor bastard when the crims find out. So there is a very strong ethical line. They just live a slightly different life to ours. We're parallel and we don't often interchange, but I like them and I trust them. Then again, there are many others that we wouldn't be caught dead with. They're just ghastly people.
I think that's the interesting thing from these conversations that we always have, conversations that have an audience of 25, is that every time we talk about these identities and these characters, there is a way to always phrase it like they are pioneers and groundbreaking and like genius, but that's if you don't take into account all of the other things that they've done. And I think that's kind of the duality that you look at with these people.
Sydney, a lot of people look at the law and order issues as black and white, and in most of law and order, and very much in the city, it's all a matter of various shades of grey. There aren't many virgins left in the city, let me assure you, and there are not that many good guys.
There you don't. Prime one. Moving on quite quickly, do you think the police today are as corrupt and incompetent as in the past? And what is the alternative? Or
I'll deal with the latter first. I don't think there is an alternative because, and this is quite often comes up when we're discussing how you investigate police doing the wrong thing. If someone can tell me who's got the skills to investigate a police officer, then I'd be quite happy, other than another police officer. Someone says, oh, we'll get a lawyer to do it. Lawyers do law, they don't do investigations. 2 incredibly different things, and it requires skill, training and experience and some basic nous. The coppers today are nowhere near as corrupt as they used to be, but that corruption back in the days we're talking about wasn't just the cops, politicians, the judiciary, businessmen for that matter. We still see property developers, of course, haven't changed. But Sydney has, back in those days, every layer of Sydney's leading lights, whether it be police, whether it be some members of the judiciary, certainly members of the legal profession, politicians obviously. Everyone was, so there were, many of them were available to have a negotiation, and cash might just change hands. Cash or power, it's all about the power game.
What do you think changed that for the New South Wales Police Force?
They got a massive kick in the backside in 1996 with the Woodrow Commission, which changed the culture. But the culture was changing. The culture started to change significantly in the early 80s when the National Times started writing some remarkable stuff about the institutionalised relationships between coppers, some businessmen and politicians. And it suddenly became exposed. And finally we started thinking about, oh, it's not coppers go out, catch bad guy, job done. It's about how it all worked. And the Woodrow Commission was probably at the end of about 15 years worth of people asking questions. And that's the important thing about media and anyone else for that matter. Always ask a question. Push it. Don't accept what they give you. Go and push them back.
That's a very good answer. I think we're going to now move on to a bit more into the key players in the murder on Oxford Street. This is a question we had last time as well. Who eventually inherited the estate? I know you touched on it with the idea that Dawn funneled all of the money from Vince into business adventures.
Yeah, it got seriously messy. The informal beneficiaries tended to be Brian Roberts, who did very, very well out of it. Dawn O'Donnell, who picked up the businesses and did very, very well out of it. Poor old Vince, who thought he was going to be a millionaire, ended up with, I think he told me he ended up with about 140,000, most of which went to his wife and kids. So Vince thought he was going to be a millionaire and turned out not to be, and he ended up having to work for the rest of his life quite hard. So essentially Brian Roberts, certainly the lion's share of it. Dawn, business-wise, she got the cash flow businesses, or got control of the cash flow businesses. And then there was an unseemly dispute by Ludwig's family over who was entitled to money. And this is the family, and this has happened so much in that period too. The family had no interest in their gay brother, or their son, or whatever, gay brother or relative or whatever it was. But all of a sudden, when there was an opportunity to get some money, they all got fascinated by it. So there were long-running brawls in the probate division of the Supreme Court over who was entitled to what was left. And I don't think anyone did well out of it. I think the lawyers made a welter, but that's about it.
That pesky pink dollar. Where is Vincent now?
Living quietly up on the Central Coast. Couple of grandkids, happy as Larry.
Good for her. What did Brian Roberts change his name to?
Mainwaring.
First name or last name?
I think he's now Brian Mainwaring. He's still around somewhere.
What were his disabilities in the fact that he couldn't kill himself?
I think he may, and I may have this completely wrong, but I think he had polio or some such thing. He had a debilitating injury that made him, walking wasn't all that easy for him. So getting around was a bit of a trial on occasions.
Right. And who is the known person referenced by the coroner?
We'll leave the known person to the known person.
That sounds vague.
I tread a careful line sometimes.
This is quite a interesting question. Do Sydney Darlinghurst streets have criminal illicit personalities? And if so, how would you characterise Forbes, Liverpool and Burton, etc.? These streets have never had a chance to have a nap, in my eyes. Like from Tilly Devine and Kate Lee to like now, those poor streets.
These streets have worked bloody hard.
Yeah.
I suppose the greatest problem in Darlinghurst, but this is a curiosity, Darlinghurst and Rowan, he was incredibly affluent, and so some genius thought, let's whack a jail in the middle of it. And that really sent the land values going down the gurgler. If you go to Darley Street, for example, Darley Street in Darlinghurst, and you walk down to the dead end, and that pile behind it that Baz Luhrmann resuscitated some years ago, magnificent.
The 12-bedroom mansion that he's talking about called Iona.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. It used to be around it. Yeah, that was an example. This beautiful Georgian property was an example of how affluent this area was until some genius thought a jail would look good here, and gallows, all that sort of stuff. I mean, the last man hung in New South Wales was done in Darlinghurst Jail. Dreadful bloody history.
Yeah.
But subsequently in the 20s and 30s, it became the hub of cocaine trafficking. Back in the mid-30s, used to be some information, back in the mid-30s, Australia's cocaine usage per capita was the highest in the world by a country mile. We inhaled...
Take me back.
And Tilly Devine and Kate Lee were pretty much running the show with a couple of interlopers from Melbourne who turned up, said we're interlopers from Melbourne, they said congratulations and died. One of them was shot to death in the street because he thought he was a chancer from Melbourne. And the ladies didn't like that very much, so that was the end of him.
Melbourne. Still.
A rivals.
Which brings me to a vaguely off-topic question. Is Mossman that bad? The laughter really speaks for itself.
Yeah. Yeah. If you wanted a suburb to typify that sort of thing, Mossman is just a jewel box.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, for those playing at home and those here, there's an amazing documentary that I spruik all the time called Between a Rock and a Hard Place. And it talks about the changing attitude between that quarter of acre block Australian heteronormative lifestyle and the kind of burgeoning queer community that kind of gave birth to the idea of Priscilla, for instance. And it's a really good kind of example of Mossman versus Darlinghurst and that kind of vibe. So I think Mossman's more used as a reference. I know every time we do one of these talks, I use a different suburb and I expose a different part of my Sydney kind of elitism hate.
I grew up over there, so I think I'm reasonably versed in getting away with it, frankly.
Yeah, I just don't like it. So, can we do a Mossman crime talk? I don't think there's anything interesting there. Like, there's a lot of white collar maybe, but...
There was the granny killer.
That was like code.
But no, Ron was more your eastern suburbs. Sorry, I'm getting specific. Cremorne, round the corner from Peter Fitzsimon's place.
Now my last two questions, so we can like charge through and you can all get a minute with Duncan alone if you want to grab him. What would Roger have been like without Dawn and vice versa? This is actually a really interesting question.
That's a great question, actually, because they would have hated each other because Roger was largely homophobic unless he wanted something, and Dawn would have seen him as a nasty little interloper. In fact, she should have gone at him, I think.
But, why was he homophobic if he had a boyfriend? Are we talking about
Roger? Oh, sorry,
Roger Rogerson. Different chat.
Shit, sorry. Wrong Roger.
Yeah.
I think they were kindred spirits and they were very effective with each other. Roger, the grand plan, Dawn, the brass to make it work.
Do you think they ever would have worked separately?
I think they did for a while. From what I could see, it was a strong alliance, but they also had their own interests somewhere. Roger always liked to open fancy restaurants, and Dawn was very much nuts and bolts, making cash flow.
Yeah, dark room sex and watered down booze.
Yeah, basically. Roger was the big picture and the sweep of the arm. Dawn was, bugger that, let's get down to work.
Yeah, well...
She was practical.
And any insight into Dawn's best and worst business decisions, ventures? I think Ruby's has always been, but when we did this last time, Ruby's was touted as probably one of her worst decisions.
I think it's probably the lesbian businesses didn't generate the large amounts of cash that the gay businesses generated. It's just the way things worked out. The gay businesses gave her vast amounts of money through, not only licensed premises, but sex on premises venue. I mean, what a great business back in 1990. Everyone pays $10. All you do is give them a towel and a bit of peace.
Yeah.
It's a fabulous business. Or you go to places like Cigna where they don't even get a towel. This is a seriously good business. The lesbian businesses weren't quite like that.
Yeah, so what do you think her best performing venue was? The Imperial?
I reckon, going back to the old days, I reckon the Exchange Hotel made a mozza. That place jumped. And Great Dawn style, there were 2 floors, and then there was the basement. The basement really did some serious money.
Is the basement where Oxford Art Factory... That's further down. Where Phoenix was?
Yes.
Oh, that
Yeah.
place. Yeah, that was like the 7th circle of hell. I loved it.
We're connecting here. And again, painted dark, turn the lights off, Bingo.
That place was a fire trap waiting to happen.
Oh, yeah.
It was
Yeah.
amazing. I loved it. Like I went up there and you knew you were alive.
Mm.
Definitely.
And you hope to stay that way.
yeah. And you came out of it.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
were from Sydney.
When the doors opened, you thought,
yeah.
another bullet dodged. Yeah, I think for me that was, and she had that for many, many years, with different licensees and also different alleged ownership. I think it was the last time we chatted about this, and there's a story I love about Dawn. I was at Internal Affairs, and I was the only one sober and upright on a Friday afternoon. And John Dowd, who's then a member of Parliament before he became a judge, John Dowd calls up the commissioner and says, "I've got a constituent with a problem. We need to talk to someone discreet." Boy, was that a mistake. Anyway, John rolls in with this pleasant young fellow who tells me that he's an executive with the Commonwealth Bank, with board access and all that sort of stuff. And John's encouraging him to talk, and he finally cracks. He says, "Look, I went out on Oxford Street one night, and the next morning, I don't remember anything, but I woke up in bed in Elizabeth Bay with a man." So what? And he said, "Oh, then it happened again a few weeks later." And I'm still thinking, so what?
Yeah.
Same. And then he said, "Then I got a call from Dawn O'Donnell. She had a proposal to the bank to refinance the Exchange Hotel, and she said she had photographs."
God, she's good.
I wasn't kind. I looked at John Dowd and said, "So what?" And it came right out of the blue, so I assume it was pretty reasonable. And John's a very honourable man, and he believed it as well. And this poor young bastard, I thought, it was just, it wasn't illegal, but it was perilously close.
I just can't imagine. Like, I can't imagine living in a time where, I guess for some people it still exists, but being terrified of being able to live your truth, and then having that held against you by a stocky lesbian with a fucking camera firmly attached to her hand. Jesus.
You had to contract pictures of Dawn with a flash cube. Gotcha, love.
We'll leave it there. So thank you all so much for coming. I hope you learned something new today. I hope you were able to share something. Please, you're welcome to stay and have a drink and chat to Duncan or anyone else in the audience if you like. Duncan, I just volunteered you to talk to people.
Oh, and just a small plug I've been reminded of, the Sydney Crime Writers Festival, BAD, starts on the second week of November, 7th of November. BAD, just remember BAD.
Are you doing anything for it?
I'm the opening act and the closing act. And there are some great acts in between. Or at the State Library, physically there.
Oh.
Real live audiences.
Wow, just like now.
Yeah, exactly. Like now, with possibly a few more people and no drinks.
Sounds awful.
And you can segue back here afterwards, because I'd be reasonably sure that some people will be wandering back this way.
And we definitely go and see them. Duncan's got some amazing stories, and there'll be more that I'm going to try and milk out of him in the coming time. So if you're not seeing him at the Sydney Crime Writers Festival, BAD, you can definitely kind of stay up to date with our social media and see what's coming up that we've got Duncan to kind of do. We'll also have, if you want to catch up on the Juanita Nelson story, it's on our YouTube.
Correct.
If you want to watch this back again, you can go onto YouTube and do that as well if you really need to. But until the next time, thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate all your support and your love. Have a very good night.
Bravo.